Okay, so this is the Israeli-Palestinian simulation with Peter BEINART. The simulation objective is to demonstrate how the common government could make peace, not only between the Palestinians and the Israelis, but with the neighbors itself. This is not a historical review of who is to blame. We are not anti-Israel or anti-Palestinians. We are for peace. Mr. BEINART is not a representative of the IPC. He was asked to comment and to opine about what we are demonstrating. We are pro-peace, and we believe that a common government will follow its own narrative. It doesn't have to follow the Israeli narrative or the Palestinian narrative. It could have its own narrative, and we believe that once it is established, it will follow its own specific narratives as it sees fit for the purpose of making peace. We do not preclude any other formulas for peace, whether it's one state, two state, other formulas for confederation. We do not oppose any of those. However, we believe that our formula is the best formula for peace, and this is what we support. Just wanted to let you know that in the past we had some disruptions. It may happen again. We're not sure, probably not, but do not be alarmed. We will block those who disrupt. The simulation expectation, we will show a constitution and legislation. The legislation is for demonstration purposes only. We are not the common government. We are just showing you what the common government could do. What we are showing today, because of the time limit, is only the tip of the iceberg. We believe that a common government could do a lot more than what we are showing today, but because of the limited time, we cannot show everything. We're asking you to look at the big picture and avoid technical arguments. Please suspend reality and try to look at the big picture. We're asking that during the simulation, you refrain from comments, but you can ask questions. Questions are okay. So the comments, you can use the chat feature in the Zoom. It's very powerful. I've used it many times, and you can use it simultaneously with the simulation, or you can wait until the end, but questions are okay. What is the difference between a comment and a question? If I show you this airplane and you say, Joseph, how does this thing fly? That would be a question. But if you say, I would never board an airplane because it causes pollution or it's unsafe, that's a comment. That's the difference. I'm asking that you would use the chat feature or wait until the end to comment about what you see. There are certain things that you'll need to accept as facts, which are facts. And let me just put my my pointers to explain that better. Okay, certain things are facts. The Israeli Prime Minister represents Israelis only, because he was elected by the Israeli election. The Palestinian leaders represent Palestinians only. These are facts. We're not asking you to assume those as facts, but we are saying these are facts. However, we are asking you to assume these things as facts. These are not facts, but we are asking you for the purpose of the simulation to assume them as facts. And those are the assumptions that we're asking you to accept as facts, that we have an online election platform in place that allows 14 million people to vote. That's in Israel, the West Bank, Gaza, and Jerusalem. We also ask you to assume as facts. This is how the simulation will play out from now until it's done. That 5 million people voted, 3 million Palestinians and 2 million Israelis voted. You will have to assume that the president received 1.5 million votes and the vice president received 1.3 million votes. That I, Joseph, I was elected as the president of the Israeli-Palestinian Confederation, and my vice president, a Palestinian, she received 1.3 million, and based on the Constitution, we will rotate in 2 years. I also want you to assume that 300 parliament members were elected. Some in Israel, some in Palestinians, but 300 were elected in 300 districts. Each parliament member represents 47,000 people. These are the assumptions that the simulation today is based upon. Now, for purposes of the simulation, we need people to volunteer to become either leaders. We need someone to be the Israeli prime minister. Do I have a volunteer to act as an Israeli prime minister today in the simulation?
A quick question, Joseph.
Yes.
Would the Israeli government permit you to conduct such an election?
The Israeli government does not have the legal authority, the moral authority, or the technical authority or ability to prevent such an election. This is an online election. It's part of the assumption. It's an online election. You know, the country of Estonia has 9.5 million people voting online, and there are many municipalities around the world, many institutions voting online. So it's not really a question of whether they allow it or not. They cannot, well, they probably not even, they may not want to prevent it, but they cannot prevent it legally, morally, or technically. Do I have someone to be the Israeli prime minister? Dan, are you willing to be the Israeli prime minister? You just asked the question.
Okay.
Okay. Do I have someone to be the Hamas leader? Do I have someone who is willing to be Hamas leader in the simulation? I need a volunteer, please.
Okay, I'll do it. I did it before.
Okay. Do I have someone who is willing to be the Palestinian Authority president?
I could do that, Joseph.
Is that Nasir?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, just so that we may run into other issues, do I have someone who is willing to be the US president?
I can be.
Yeah.
Okay, US president. What is your first initials?
I'm Giacomo. So
Oh, Giacomo.
GG.
Do I have Russian president? Do I have China's
I
president?
will, yeah.
Okay, I'm sorry, can you give me the first, you are, okay, I'll put EB is the Russian. Do I have China's president?
Yes, Joseph, it's me. It's
Okay.
Abed.
Abed, and do I have World Bank leader?
Yes. Yes, Joseph, it's Mohammed.
Okay. Terrific, okay. Okay, let's go on. Does anyone have any questions about the assumptions? Mr. BEINART, do you have any questions or issues about the assumptions that were presented in this simulation?
No.
Okay.
I have a question. Yes.
Anyone from the audience have any questions regarding the assumptions?
Yes, I do. When Emmanuel,
Yes.
when you talk about Palestinians, Israeli citizens who are Palestinians, are there in this simulation, are there Palestinians or Israelis?
Well, there are two issues. The first issue is voting, and the second issue is running. So are you talking about running for parliament or voting? Because voting, it really makes no difference if you are
Okay.
Palestinian or Israeli.
No, it's
But
just
running,
Oh, okay.
running, it does make a difference. And it would depend on them how they want to present themselves. They are putting themselves for election. They'll put their name and they can put whatever title they want to put on themselves. And the public will judge whether they are truly Israelis or truly Palestinians.
Okay.
Any other questions about the assumptions?
Yeah, I have a question just about I think it fits in with this about, would this kind of common government be legitimate? How would you establish a legitimate common government that would be recognized?
Well, the legitimacy would come from the election, just like any democracy. A democracy, any democracy in the world, obtain its legitimacy from the public, from the people. And the people give it legitimacy by participating in the election and by voting. And this would not be different. Any other questions? Okay, so I'm going to go to the next. The rest of you, I would ask to choose your nationality, because the rest of you, I would ask to be parliament members, either Israeli or Palestinian. Mr. BEINART, I would also ask you to choose to be either Israeli parliament member or Palestinian parliament member. And the way to do it is put a PA in front of your name if you are Palestinian. This is right-click before your name, or an IS if you're Israeli. Because you will be asked to vote. This is a simulation. This is not a lecture. So I'm going to go through some of the participants and ask, okay, PA Asim, okay, I see. Sean, are you Israeli or Palestinian?
Palestinian.
Okay, so put a PA. If you cannot, if you don't know how to do it, Dan will do it for you.
Okay.
AJ Ray, are you Israeli or Palestinian? Basim, are you Israeli or Palestinian? Claire, are you Israeli or Palestinian? Bernice. So I'm not going to go through each one of you, but please either chat to Dan or chat to tell us who you are, Israeli or Palestinian, because you will be asked to vote in this simulation. And you'll be asked to vote either Israeli or Palestinian. But I want you to remember, you are a parliament member, you represent your district. Whether you are Israeli or Palestinian, you do not represent the entire Israeli nation or Palestinian nation. You only represent your district because you were elected by your district. I represent the entire area because I was elected by the entire area as a president. The Israeli prime minister represents his constituents. The Palestinian represent his constituents. Now, some of you, either Israeli or Palestinian, may be in a mixed district. So you have to keep that in mind. Keep that in mind in your head. Are you Israeli in an exclusively Israeli district or Palestinian in an exclusively Palestinian district? Or you may be from an area where you have both Israelis and Palestinians. You could be an Israeli who was elected by Palestinians or Palestinian elected by Israelis. It is completely possible. Okay, so please change your name or decide who you are and tell Dan if you want him to put an IS or PA, or put that in the chat, and we'll do it. Okay, so we need to go on because there is a lot of work for us to do. The first thing is we need to pass a constitution. Now that we have been elected, we have to pass a constitution. So let me read you the constitution. We believe the Palestinians and Israelis are entitled to equal rights under the law and guaranteed human rights and freedom. The Israeli-Palestinian Confederation does not intend to supersede or supplant the Palestinians or Israeli governments, nor to abrogate or undermine any agreements between those governments. We recognize that the government of Israel is the legitimate government of the Israeli people, and the government of Palestine is the legitimate government of the Palestinian people. Our purpose is to resolve conflict and to expand the relationship between Palestinians and Israelis in a fair and equitable manner. We believe in equal rights under the law, guaranteed human rights, and freedom for all. We voluntarily give the legislators and the governments of Israel and Palestine veto power over legislation we pass relating to the sovereignty of those nations. We believe in the separation of power between the legislative, executive, and judicial branches. We believe in the creation of a secular government for the people residing in Israel and Palestine. We believe in having a separate judicial branch relating to the Israeli-Palestinian Confederation legislation, with Israeli and Palestinian judges with a system to avoid biased decision based on nationality. So the key, really, the key paragraph is this. We give the, where is my pen? Can I find my pen? We give the, this is, we voluntarily give the legislator and the governments of Israel and Palestine veto power over legislation we pass relating to the sovereignty of those nations. This is, obviously, this is not the entire Constitution. It's the important part that I pulled out of the Constitution. If you want to read the whole Constitution, you can go to our website. Does anyone have any, does anyone have any questions regarding the Constitution?
Yeah, could you just tell us what you mean by sovereignty of those nations?
Yeah, good question. If we need, in order to implement the legislation, if we cannot do it unless the Israeli government or the Palestinian government agree, that would mean that if we do it without their agreement, it violates their sovereignty. But if we pass legislation that does not, we don't need their agreement, we can implement it without their agreement, it doesn't violate their sovereignty. Thank you. Any other questions?
Yes, Joseph, I just want to ask if is the IPC a subversive government?
No, it's not a subversive government. We do not intend to undermine the Israeli or the Palestinian governments. We support those governments. It says that in the Constitution. We do not intend to supersede or supplant the Palestinian or the Israeli government. In fact, we are giving them a veto power. So we are not here to undermine or dismantle those governments.
Another question. Regarding the sovereignty, do you assume that the borders are already settled and that there's no issue of borders?
No, we do not assume that at all. We assume that if we pass legislation, for instance, we're going to have legislation regarding building a joint economic zone between Israel and Gaza. In order to do that, we understand that we cannot do it unless the Israeli government and the Palestinian government would agree. So we don't really It's not about the border. It's about whether we can implement the legislation we want. And you'll see that, maybe that's one of the legislation we'll pass today.
So, but where is Palestinian sovereignty now? Where is it delineated?
We are not here to clarify the issues between the Israelis and the Palestinians.
Okay.
We are saying that in order for us to implement, we understand that we cannot implement certain legislation unless we include the Israeli government and the Palestinian government. When we determine that it is necessary to include them in order to implement our legislation, that's when we give those governments a veto power.
Okay.
Any other questions?
Sorry.
I have a question.
Oh, go ahead.
Okay, you can ask the question, but we're going to take a vote. And I'm going to ask the Palestinian parliament member, I'm going to launch the vote. The Palestinian parliament members, do you support the Israeli-Palestinian Confederation Constitution? Just the Palestinian parliament.
Joseph, our guest had a question.
Oh, okay, I'm sorry.
So that when you say the Palestinian government, that you're referring to the Palestinian, to the PLO, the Palestinian Authority. Did it include Hamas? I'm just want to understand how we define the Palestinian government for these purposes.
Well, we have not defined the Palestinian government, but we're going to do it in the next legislation. We have not defined who the government is. We did not define the Israeli government. We did not define the Palestinian government. We did not define who those governments, who we want to give a veto power to.
Okay.
Okay, so the 100%, okay, let me share the results. 100% of the Palestinian parliament members ratified the Constitution. Let me stop sharing. And I'm going to ask the Israeli, I'm sorry.
And you can remind them that the voters are just the members of the parliament, not the.
Yeah, the voters are only the parliament members.
Yes.
Okay, let me have the Israeli now vote. This is still the Palestinians, so I don't know why it's not giving me, it made some, I didn't let the Israelis vote yes. Share the results. Stop sharing. Okay, I don't know if you guys see it, but
No.
okay, let me start from the beginning. So we have the Palestinian voted. Okay, now could the Israeli parliament members vote? Okay, I'm going to end the polling. Going to share the results. 91% of the Israeli parliament members voted. So congratulations, we have a constitution. Okay, so Mr. BEINART asked a good question. Who is the government? So now we're going to vote on that. Who do we want to give a veto power to? Because that's not part of the Constitution. So we now need to vote on that. This is our declaration of intent to grant the veto power. The Confederation is the government of the entire population of Israel, the West Bank, and Gaza. We hereby bestow a veto power relating to legislation affecting sovereignty to the following: the government of Israel, the Palestinian Authority, and Hamas. Now, I want you to realize this is just, I am the president, this is the legislation I proposed. and also to realize that we do not give a veto power on this declaration to grant the veto power because it's internal to us. Does anyone have any questions regarding this declaration of intent to grant the veto power? Okay, I hear no questions. We're going to take a vote. You know, Zoom changed their voting system, so it's a little, but that's okay. Okay, Palestinian parliament members only. Do you support the declaration of intent to grant a veto power? Okay, I'm going to end the polling. Share the results. 92% of the Palestinian parliament members voted in favor of the declaration of to give veto power. I'm going to now have the Israeli vote.
I want to clarify something, excuse me. Do you mean that we bestow veto power to all these three elements at this time, or is that another vote? Are we just talking about bestowing the veto power?
This is another vote on whether we want to, I as the president, I propose giving veto power to the existing Israeli government and the Palestinian government and Hamas government.
Okay.
For some reason, this is still the Palestinian vote. Okay, I got what's wrong. Okay. Do you support the declaration? Now, this is for the Israelis. Do you support the declaration of intent to grant the veto power? This is for the Israeli parliament members only, not the Hamas leader, not the Israeli leader, only the Israeli parliament member. Please vote. Do you guys see the vote?
No.
No.
No,
No, no.
Oh,
there it goes.
Yes.
Now it's showing.
okay.
So it's showing for a second and then disappearing.
Yep.
Exactly.
Didn't see it.
Just pops up and goes off.
Yeah, it didn't show.
Oh,
Okay, do you see the vote now?
No.
came and went.
Yeah,
Please,
again, it pops up
when
and
put the
disappears.
poll, didn't give me time to put my opinion. I need time to choice.
Yeah, no, it's something.
Please.
Okay.
No one give voice.
Do you see it now?
No.
No.
Mr. Avisa, I think I am the Russian
let's see
president,
it.
but I find myself receiving the ballots.
Okay, do you see it now?
Goes away.
It pops up and goes away. That's all that's happening.
Okay, there's
No,
something
no
wrong.
one can see that.
Okay, so let's have a verbal vote. This is Israeli parliament members.
Sorry to interrupt, but
Please say yes or no.
yes.
Yes.
Yes. Yeah.
No. No.
Yes.
No.
Yes. Yes.
Okay, so it looks like the yes have won, and now we agree to give a veto power to all these three governments. Mr. BEINART, can I have your comments regarding this, the Constitution and the declaration of intent to grant the veto power?
Well, if I try to think of myself as voting in the way that an average Israeli politician would vote, since I imagine someone voting who's elected is Israeli and is elected by mostly Israelis, which I think most of the Israeli members would be elected mostly by Israelis, although perhaps there'll be a few who are elected with majority of Palestinian votes. I would think my assumption is that most Israelis, politicians generally favor the status quo. They are generally comfortable with a sovereign Israel which controls Palestinians in various different ways and does not give them equal rights. And so if I think about it from that perspective, putting aside my own moral views, I would think that an Israeli politician would not want, would certainly want the Israeli government to have veto power, but also would not want this new government to be able to do anything that interfered with Israel's ability to do what it's doing now. So that's what makes me, I guess, maybe perhaps pessimistic about what the Israeli side would permit this joint government to do. But I admire the effort to think outside the box and try to imagine how people might act differently if presented with different opportunities. So I hope that I hope that I'll hear things that maybe make me think differently.
Okay, so basically, from what I hear from you, you're saying the Israeli government would be skeptical, it would not be supportive, and it would want it to go away, basically.
Yes.
Okay, so, but this government has been created. 5 million people voted. So now we have 300 parliament members, and therefore we are now, we gave the Israeli and the Palestinian governments a veto power, and we decide to go to the first, because of the strong opposition of Israel, we want to go to the first piece of legislation that would be teaching tolerance and understanding. And that's the first piece of legislation. Both educational systems to teach tolerance in their public schools. Devote a certain number of hours for both sides to teach the history of the Israelis and the Palestinians, as well as teaching Arabic and Hebrew. Educators to draft textbooks together and arrange for a regular exchange of teachers. Public media on both sides to provide fair and equal coverage for teaching tolerance. IPC will be the facilitator to ensure that both sides are fairly represented. Now, this legislation would be given, we would give a veto power to the Israeli and the Palestinian leaders. But let's, first of all, does anyone have any questions regarding this legislation? Okay, I hear no questions, so let's take a vote.
Joseph, can you say something about what you mean by teaching tolerance?
Yes, teaching the history, acceptance of each other, teaching Hebrew and Arabic to each other, and exchanging professors and teachers so that Israeli teachers can go to the Palestinian and present the Israeli point of view. Palestinian teachers can go to the Israeli side and teach the Palestinian side. And both sides will be able to teach the history and the point of view of each other, not necessarily reaching a consensus, but teaching each other's view on the conflict. So let's take a vote. Hopefully the polling will...
Sorry, before the vote, please. Also, there is something here concerning the regular exchange of teachers. I would suggest that probably rather than having an exchange of teachers, that the Israeli teachers move over to a Palestinian school and the Palestinian teacher moves over to Israeli setting. Why not restore the whole educational system, provide a kind of synergy where both
Okay,
can
Mr.
operate
Russian
together
President,
and yeah.
Mr. Russian President, we are taking a vote. Let's put those comments in the chat because we need to move rapidly on many issues. Please.
All right.
Okay.
Okay.
So do you see the vote now?
Yes.
Okay. So Palestinian parliament members, please vote.
Yep.
%94. Okay, I'm going to end the polling, share the results. 94% of the Palestinian parliament members voted yes. Now I have a feeling that something happened with Zoom, so I'm just going to ask the Israeli parliament members. How do you vote on, please say your vote on teaching tolerance?
Yes.
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 Okay.
I think if
Yes.
I were trying to imagine an Israeli parliament member, I would vote no.
Okay.
You're right, Peter.
Okay, so that's fine. This is a democracy. You can vote no. That's fine. But now let's talk to the Israeli Prime Minister. Mr. Prime Minister, are you going to veto this legislation?
Not as long as we have editorial approval over the final content of the textbooks.
How about Mrs. Hamas leader? Are you going to veto this legislation?
No, I'm not. I agree with that it has to be done properly, but I'm for giving it an effort.
Okay, how about the Palestinian Authority leader?
I will not veto this legislation.
All right, so this legislation passed. It was not vetoed. Mr. BEINART, now you have an opportunity to comment about this, what you just saw in the legislation and how it was voted.
So again, maybe forgive me if I'm being overly cynical or pessimistic. I think that many people might support tolerance in theory, but if I think about, for instance, whether the Israeli government, what the politics would be like for an Israeli politician of requiring, let's say in Haredi ultra-Orthodox schools, that they be required to bring in Arabic teachers and teach tolerance as, a secular person would define tolerance. I think that would be a huge political headache, certainly in the Haredi schools, and probably not just in the Haredi schools. I can imagine how Shas and Agudat Yisrael would respond to those teachers who were going to come into their schools to teach tolerance in Arabic. And if I were an Israeli politician, I would think, I don't want to deal with that headache. So again, this is my real politique answer, obviously not my moral perspective of what I believe, but my trying to imagine the way an Israeli politician.
I understand. And what would you do when someone who is about to be enlisted in the army tells you that there is an opportunity to make peace and you are vetoing legislation, and you said, Mr. Prime Minister, I'm putting you in that position, that you will turn every rock to make peace, and you will not allow any possibility of someone being killed, and you will do whatever you can to make peace. You're going to say that because of the Haredis' refusal to teach tolerance, you're going to put my child at risk to die?
Well, I'm not the prime minister though, right?
I understand, but you represented that position. You're saying that the Haredi would control the whole politics of this situation.
They do now.
They do now because there is no common government.
I mean,
there is no, but I'm not going to argue. I'm just going to present this. Let's go on to the next.
I mean, Roger sent me an interesting, Roger sent me an interesting note saying that if I'm a member of the IPC, by definition, I have already accepted the notion of a common equal constitution. And so it's not correct for me to imagine myself as similar to a current Knesset member. This would have to be someone who had a fundamentally different essentially perspective. I think most Knesset members, I think, would say peace is not possible anytime soon, and we're not really focused on it. We're just focusing on as much security and prosperity for Israeli as possible. But if you're asking me to imagine that in order to run, I've already accepted the basic framework of equality, then I would vote differently.
Well, you don't have to vote differently. You could be, let's assume you could be an Israeli parliament member that represents a Haredi district. Perfectly possible.
Right.
And you would vote against it. But there would be
I think,
other
but-
Israeli, there
but
would be
be-
other Israeli from Tel Aviv, from Jerusalem, from Haifa, from Eilat, who would vote different. That's a democracy.
But on the other hand, Peter, like he said, he's a member of this IPC, though, therefore he would embrace such a thing, and it would be the job of the Israeli prime minister, who did not veto this, to sell it to his more religious school people and constituents.
All right.
So therefore, it's shifted to him.
Let's go to the next.
Okay.
A joint economic zone. Joint economic zone, JEZ, between Israel and Gaza. Exclusive IPC management and control, common economy, education, industry, agriculture, sewer treatment, desalination plants, solar farms and wind power and green energy, international airport and seaport, equally accessible to the Israeli and the Palestinians. This does require the no veto from the government. Does anyone have any questions regarding this legislation? Okay, I hear no questions. I'm going to have a vote. Palestinian parliament members only. Do you support the joint economic zone? Okay, I'm going to.
This is the best idea of found free zone, economic free zone for Israeli and Palestinian.
I'm going to end the polling. And I'm going to share the results. 100% of the Palestinian parliament members voted in favor of this legislation. Let's take a verbal vote from the Israelis. Do you support this legislation of joint economic zone?
Yes.
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 No.
Yes.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah, I think I would vote also probably if I were representing, then I would vote no.
Okay. So Peter, let's focus on you. What district do you represent? Where is your district?
Let's say I represent, I don't know, Ashkelon.
Okay, perfect. So Ashkelon has been bombarded. You have 43,000 people in your district.
Yes.
And we have agriculture, we have industry in Ashkelon, and the Israeli government hasn't been able to give peace to Ashkelon. And here is an opportunity to change the whole area, very close to Ashkelon, with a joint economic zone between Israel and Gaza. So what would be your rationale in voting no against this legislation?
Well, if I think of myself as representing the wishes of the population of Ashkelon as I understand them, as expressed in the votes that take for Israeli elections. Now, maybe I might run on a very different platform, but I suspect that the person who's most likely to win from Ashkelon is going to be somebody who represents the perspectives of the people in Ashkelon as represented by the way they tend to vote today. And the way they tend to vote today, unfortunately, from my perspective, is to believe that the status quo in which Gaza is blockaded provides them more security than they would get if the blockade would be lifted, because they believe that, or a majority of them believe that that the lifting of the blockade would allow Hamas to get more rockets and they would face more bombardment. That's not I personally disagree with them. I think that they would be safer if people in Gaza could live decent and free lives and prosper economically. But when I look at the way they vote now, they don't seem convinced by that argument.
Okay, when you ran for parliament,
yes,
you told the people for
yes.
a whole year that
Yes.
you want to bring peace, you want to bring prosperity,
yes.
you want to bring that you are running because the Israeli government failed to give peace to Ashkelon.
Mm-hmm.
You are running, you told the people that you are running because the Israeli government for 73 years have shown no imagination. And now you are voting in the exact same way as the Israeli government you think would run? Is that how you're explaining your vote?
Well, I'm imagining that now it's possible that I, by the force of my own rhetoric and arguments, could convince the people of Ashkelon to think differently than they think now. But I am kind of the view that generally people don't change their perspective dramatically unless they're forced to. I think that and so I don't think that people of Ashkelon are going to be convinced to see things fundamentally differently just because I can lay out a good vision for them. I think that there's too much trauma and there's too much, frankly, anti-Palestinian racism.
That's fine. So, but in this vote, the people from Tel Aviv, most of the people, the Israeli people, voted in favor of this legislation. So you are in the minority. Let's ask the Hamas leader, first of all, are you going to veto this legislation?
No, I'm not.
Let's talk to the Israeli prime minister. You represent the Israeli people. Are you going to veto this legislation? Mr. Israeli Prime Minister, Dan?
Yes.
Are you going to veto this legislation?
We would not veto it, but before this legislation, before we would approve it, we would need Hamas to agree to cease all aggression.
Okay, we are not asking you to approve it. We're asking, do you veto it?
Well, again, we would not veto it.
Okay, what about the Palestinian Authority? Are you going to veto this legislation?
No, I will not veto it.
Okay, so now let's go to the next legislation, because we agreed on a joint economic zone and we would like to have the funds to create the joint economic zone. So now we are applying to the World Bank, other countries, an international organization for a 5-year, $100 billion grant to create a solid financial backing in order to implement the IPC's vision and its legislation in the next 5 years with full financial transparency directly related to proof of success. We are not asking we're not giving a veto power to the governments because it doesn't infringe on their sovereignty. But let's take a vote. Does anyone have a question regarding this?
Yeah, I have a question, sorry, because you asked the Hamas government, the PA government, and the Israeli government to whether they would veto that legislation or not. And at the same time, you said that does not infringe on the sovereignty of Israel. I don't understand why you're doing this.
Well, this is money for us. This is money.
Sorry,
We don't need.
I meant
we
the previous.
don't need the authority of the Israeli government
I meant the previous, the plan itself that you basically decided to put on hold.
No,
Yeah,
we did give them a veto power and they declined to veto it.
Yeah, but why would you do that knowingly that this won't infringe on the sovereignty of any of the parties involved? Because you said there are some issues that are not going to be vetoed anyway, because they would not touch on the sovereignty of each of each concerned party, meaning the Israeli government, the Palestinian Authority, and Hamas. Why would you do such a thing?
Okay, the joint economic zone requires physical land. And in order to have the physical land that is under the control of Israel and Hamas, we cannot do it unless we give them a veto power. And we gave them a veto power and they declined to veto because they understood the economic and the environmental benefit of this legislation.
So what does that mean? It means that when you have a legislation, it has to go first to get the green light from the two governments, in this case, the Hamas government and the Israeli government, before.
Okay,
we
this is,
put this
look,
on-
put that in your comment. This is how we chose to do it. We
Okay.
voted, they accepted the vote, and we're going to go on. Let's go on to the financial foundation. Does anyone have any questions regarding the financial foundation?
I do have a question.
Yes.
Whenever you go for a loan this large, there's usually some kind of, how do we say it, collateral. And I'd be concerned because of some of the things that international lenders are doing as collateral, like saying we're going to take over your port.
Well,
if you do
let
not
me
pay it.
stop you there because it's a grant. It's not a collateral.
Okay, a grant. Okay, I got you. Okay, great.
Okay, let's take a vote. Let's have the Palestinian parliament member voting. On the financial foundation. Palestinian parliament members, please vote. Okay, I'm going to end the polling. Share the results. 100% of the Palestinian parliament members voted. Let's have the Israeli parliament members vote verbally.
Yes. Yes.
Yes.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay,
Yes.
terrific. Let's have the Mr. President, US President. How much are you willing to commit out of the 5? Remember, we just finished a vote. 5 million people voted. This is a game changer situation. You always said that you're in favor of peace. And here we have a common Israeli-Palestinian Confederation parliament that was elected 300 parliament members. And we want to do good to the people of Israel and Palestine. And we're asking you to give money. How much money are you willing to give?
Joseph, what did you, am I the president?
No, I believe Giacomo is the president.
Okay.
Yes, I favor peace. The US favors peace in Israel. However, we do have skepticism on the real willingness of certain parties, including Hamas. And so we could offer conditional support. At the beginning, we could offer limited support for some small projects. If we see progress, we will be willing to go further. So if I would go back to the IPC and ask them to put some concrete, smaller steps. For instance, you talked about this economic zone, about an airport and stuff like that. Some of these projects we might want to look into and provide our support, financial support.
So how much money are you willing to give, Mr. President?
This is a very subject to the actual.
Mr. President, you give $4 billion to Israel every year for war. And I'm asking you to give money for peace. And I hear only excuses from you. Could you tell the people of the world how much money you're willing to give for peace? We are not Hamas. We are a separate government.
We want to see real, a gesture and feel encouraged by what you guys do by seeing some.
Well, feeling encouraged is not enough. We need money.
We can offer some aid for your operational expenses. So we would perhaps provide a few $1 million at the beginning, and then we would in the future.
Mr. President, you give $4 billion for war every year.
Let's say that
give us half.
A few $1 million is an insult. And if you do not commit a significant amount, I am going to go to the world media and condemn you for not being a person of peace. So let's go to the Russian president. Mr. Russian president, how much are you willing to give? And I'm going to go to the Chinese president. Mr. President of China, how much are you willing to give?
Well, we, the Chinese people, have no historical involvement in the conflict, but we look at the future and we think it is vital for the world peace, and it goes beyond the Palestinians and the Israelis, and we are expanding our economy, and so I think it's a great investment for peace and for our interest to probably donate $10 billion.
Thank you. Okay. Mr. US President and Russian President, the Chinese President is willing to give $10 billion. Tell us how much you're willing to give. And let me go to the World Bank leader. Mr. World Bank leader, how much are you willing to give?
So because we want to ensure that any projects that will be implemented will be successful, we need to have on board the American and the Russian leaders as well. And in case of their agreement to donate, we can also contribute $20 billion for the.
Okay, let me go back to the president of the US.
Yes,
Mr.
okay,
President, I just came from China and I received a huge commitment from the Chinese president. Have you thought about this and willing to give some money?
Okay, we will give a financial envelope of up to $1 billion, subject to concrete progress in peace in Palestine.
$1 billion a year?
For the first year, it will be $1 billion.
Okay, so, and Mr. Russian President? Mr. Russian President, how much are you willing to give? And let me go to the Israeli Prime Minister. Mr. Israeli Prime Minister, how much are you willing to give?
I will give 2% of the money from our security and national budget towards the peace initiative.
Okay, that's a lot, because your budget is about 67 billion shekels a year, so that's tremendous. Thank you. What about the Hamas leader? How much are you willing to give?
Well, here's where I am stuck, because as Hamas, we don't have much money. We're always fighting to get money, so I really don't.
Well, you are getting a lot of money from Iran. You're getting a lot of money from the Kuwaitis. We know you're getting a lot of money, and you need to show your commitment for peace.
I'm totally committed, so let's just say I'll I'll do the 1 billion. If that's
1 billion is too much. You don't have 1 billion.
for the whole, for the 5 years.
Yeah, that's too much. It's $200 million a year. That's way too much. If you give $20 million a year, that would be great.
Okay, cool.
Okay, and what about the PA, President?
We have a budget, I'm looking up 1.3 billion a year. So if we say 1, 3, let's see, what would that be? Times that by 1. How about 40 million?
Terrific. Okay, so I'm gonna stop sharing. And I'm going to have a conversation with Mr. BEINART. I think you got the idea here. We have a lot more legislation. But let me ask you a question, Mr. BEINART. Do you see peace as a threat to Israel or to the identity of the Jewish people in America?
Depends what one means by peace. I think for most, I think that the peace that we assume in this conversation, which is what I also support, is a peace that's based on equality. And the assumption is that there can only be true peace if all people have basic rights, because the denial of rights is itself a form of violence. And so if you deny people rights, that in itself is violence, and it's likely to produce more violence. But I don't think that's the way most Israeli Jews, at least as expressed in their voting behavior, see things. And I don't think it's the way that the more influential elements of American Jewish society see things. I think that the way they see things is that Israeli Jews have enough peace, not ideal, but they are doing well enough in terms of their basic security and prosperity, and that to overturn that system of Jewish privilege that they enjoy in favor of a situation of equality, which would mean a pretty radical shift in the way in the structure of the state under which they live, given that the state is built on Jewish privilege, would be for them very threatening. And I think that's not unusual for Israeli Jews. I think that's generally the way that people who have privileges, who have a kind of generally tend to be very unwilling to roll the dice and give it up and in favor of equality, unless they can see that the system is starting to really not work for them, whether it was in the South during the civil rights movement or in parts of South Africa or Northern Ireland. I think, unfortunately, people tend not to give up those privileges until they are confronted with realities that make them realize that the status quo is not sustainable and that it's not going to work ultimately for them. And I don't think Israeli Jews have gotten to that point.
Well, the IPC idea is that the minority in the Israeli society and the minority in the Palestinian society together will be a force to create a change, putting them together.
Right, but look at the Israeli political spectrum now. Even the furthest left Zionist party, Meretz, is still willing to sit in a government led by Naftali Bennett. They would be, among Israeli Jews, they would be, and they're a very small party, they would be your most likely partners. If you want to find an Israeli party that actually supports genuine full equality, you even have to go to Hadash, right, which is a party that's mostly supported by Palestinian citizens of Israel. So you right now there was a time when Meretz was larger in the early 1990s, but it seems to me that sliver of Israeli society that one then can work with, which is even close to a vision of true equality, is unfortunately right now very small. And I think it could grow, but I don't think it's likely to grow unless Israelis unless Israelis see that the status quo is not comfortable for them. And right now, the status quo, I think, is relatively comfortable, not perfect, but relatively comfortable.
So can I ask a question? Do you
Wait,
think
wait,
that?
hold on a second. No, I'm asking a question and then we'll open it up to a discussion.
Sure.
So, Mr. BEINART, are you saying that the assumption that 2 million people, 5 million people voted is unrealistic out of the 14 million?
Yes. If I had to guess, I would guess that the Israeli government would not allow such a vote.
How would they prevent it?
That's an interesting question, I suppose, given that it's on Zoom. I mean that it's online. You know, that requires that gets us into technical issues that I am not as I'm not versed well enough. But I think that I think my sense is that there would be some effort to make it difficult and for people to vote, and maybe even to punish people. And I also think that the public conversation in Israel, in Jewish Israeli society, would stigmatize this. I mean, again, think about the way in which Israeli Jews talk about Ben and Jerry's and what they've done, right? I think most Israeli Jews would see Ben and Jerry's actions as anti-Semitic, if not, and hostile. And so I think that, unfortunately, it would not be that hard to stigmatize such an effort in Israeli Jewish society as basically an effort to destroy or undermine the security of the Jewish state. And I think a lot of people would be influenced by that point of view. I hope I'm wrong. I want to make it clear. I think what you're doing is valuable and important, and I support these kind of thinking. I'm just trying to think based on how I see the reality as I interpret it in Israeli Jewish society today. There are others here who obviously may have a different perspective, including some from Israel, who may have more to bring to the conversation.
In America, African America obtained equality.
Yes.
Without the white majority having some significant event that caused them to agree with equality. Why would it be different in Israel-Palestine?
I think what happened in the United States in the 1960s is that Martin Luther King was able to convince Lyndon Johnson that unless they passed voting rights and equal and the right to equal accommodations, there would be a lot of violence. That basically King said, listen, things are going to blow up here if you continue to deny Black people their rights. And remember, there were uprisings in American cities every summer between 1964 and 1968, and then that forced enough white American leaders to realize that they should give Black Americans certain rights in order to try to keep the society quiet. And prevent Malcolm X or his vision from coming. And so I think that's my interpretation of how things happened in the US.
But so the threat of violence was enough to cause change. Why would the threat of violence...
Joseph, not just, there was the threat of violence, and also there was massive nonviolent mobilization. I mean, there was a huge mobilization of Black Americans. No, equivalent to the Palestinian Authority who are keeping things under control. There was massive nonviolent mobilization and the threat of violent mobilization. I think those two things in combination convinced wise white American leaders that they had to shift course. And like you said, enormous opposition.
All right.
And like you said, there was violence.
I'm going to open it up for a vote. Let's ask Nasser to ask the first question.
Yeah, thank you, Peter, and also thank you for your contributions. I've read many of your articles. My question to you is, when you talk about Israeli Jews seeing themselves as privileged and it's hard for them to accept change, do you feel that convincing them to change will have to be a force from the outside, or will it be something like a nonviolent movement from the inside? And I'm referring to countries for example, that participated in boycott, divestment, sanctions, and or does it have to be like, say, what we saw with the people in inside the country, like the people protesting in Sheikh Jarrah and in Jerusalem? What will change Israeli minds?
I mean, again, I'm speculating, but I think if one looks at what happened in apartheid South Africa in the 1980s, two things happened. First of all, the local allies of the ANC, called the United Democratic Front, basically had a concerted campaign of boycotts and protests, and basically what they called to make the townships ungovernable. It's in some ways exactly the opposite of what the PA has done. The PA has basically worked with Israel to keep things quiet. The ANC and UDF strategy was the opposite, was basically to raise the cost. So the Israeli military, the South African military had to send its troops into the black townships every single day and fight pitched battles. And so the black South Africans suffered terribly, but the cost of control went way up. Again, a little bit like, imagine the first Intifada, right? They had an Intifada that the South African government realized might never end. You also then had a powerful, legitimate Black-led organization that offered a moral vision of equality that galvanized the entire world and galvanized external pressure. And because the Soviet Union collapsed, that ANC was no longer a communist party, so it didn't threaten white economic privilege, which then led a group of white leaders to think, the status quo is untenable, but we could have a black government and we could still maintain our economic privilege. That's a better bet. And that was that confluence of forces. It seems to me we don't have those same set of forces that right now in Israel-Palestine that existed in South Africa in the mid to late 1980s.
Emmanuel, you want to ask a question?
But could I just?
No, actually, I took my hand down because I wanted to make a comment, so I'm not doing that.
Okay. But to touch base on Peter, a real follow up. But do you see? Was it easier to generate international support for Blacks in South Africa than it is for international support for Palestinians? Because it seems to me like internationally we can say, oh, Black people, yes, let's stand up for Black rights. But Palestinians seem to be more demonized in the international world. The terrorists and the Jews are the sufferers of the Holocaust. Let's feel sorry for them.
Well, yes, it's hard. First of all, the anti-apartheid movement, Black Americans were at the heart of the anti-apartheid movement, and they had and they were already the base of the Democratic Party, and they had an obvious and strong connection to Black South Africans, right? The equivalent group in the United States would be Palestinian, Arab, and maybe Muslim Americans who don't have as much political influence in the Democratic Party or any party as Black Americans had in the 1980s, A. B, because of the real existence of anti-Semitism and the Holocaust, there's much more global sympathy for Jews and the Zionist project than there ever was for the project of Afrikaner nationalism. Plus, Israel is a much more economically dynamic society that has many, many services and products that many countries around the world want. Which
do you read Theodore Herzl's theory? Theodore Herzl?
Yes, I've read a lot of Theodor Herzl. So my point is that I think Israel is much more difficult to isolate Israel internationally than it was apartheid South Africa.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. BEINART.
Mr. BEINART, let me ask you. Israel constantly says that it supports peace and it would do everything possible to make peace with the Palestinians. What possible argument could they have in order to create a legitimate opposition, or would they oppose an Israeli-Palestinian Confederation if it doesn't threaten them at all?
I think that I think that mainstream Israeli politicians today would see that as a threat. I think anything which could threaten Israel's ability to operate with as few limitations as possible, I think mainstream Israeli politicians today would see as a threat. Even things that might seem relatively small, like again, Ben & Jerry's or some UN resolution on settlements that ultimately has no enforcement power, still produces very strong Israeli government opposition, not just from the Israeli right, but from the Israeli center, as well.
Yeah, I'm not questioning whether they'll see it as a threat. I'm asking what would be their rationale? What could they explain? How could they explain their opposition to a common government?
I think that, look, if you live in the American Jewish community, and if you live in, you hear these things all the time. It's that Palestinians want to destroy Israel. They don't, they don't want Israeli Jews to be there. They never wanted them to be there in the first place. They still don't want them to be there. I'm not commenting on the accuracy of this claim. I'm commenting on how widespread this perception, this argument is. It's almost hegemonic in American Jewish leadership, and I think in much of Israel too. So that's what people are going to say. You may not find it convincing. I don't find it convincing. I think most Palestinians, would be prepared to live alongside Israeli Jews in a condition of equality. But that's not the way. That's not the way most Israeli Jews, and that's not the way most influential American Jews see it. I mean, it's the world in which I live. This is how people talk.
Well, okay, man, let me push you further. They could say that Palestinians want to destroy Israel, but this is not a Palestinian. This is a common government made with Israelis and Palestinians, plus they have a veto power over it. So it's not a matter of accuracy, it's a matter of, do they have, did we lose Peter?
No, I'm here.
Okay, it's not a matter of, do the Palestinians want to destroy Israel or not? That's not really the question. The question is, what is Israel's vision for the future? How does it want to stay in a constant war, or does it have a vision for peace? And what is their vision for peace?
I see we reached 1:30, so I'm going to have to go momentarily, but I know that Emmanuel Shahaf, whose work I follow and have learned from, has wanted to say something. So maybe, I don't know, maybe he wants to jump in, given that he unlike me, is an Israeli.
Thanks, Peter. I do want to say something. I think first of all, Peter has a very good pulse of the situation in Israel, of the political situation and the reality we face here. I think the basic premise of a confederation is problematic because Israel will not allow another sovereignty, and confederation implies that there's more than one sovereignty. I think that's the main issue. So when you start up looking at confederation, first of all, it's a two-state solution, okay? And we can't get to two states because we can't agree on the borders and we can't agree on the arrangements. So
what do you mean the confederation is a two-state solution?
Confederation implies, unless you say something against
we
that.
We have a constitution where there is no...
Yes, no, but there is more than one sovereignty, okay? There's more than one sovereignty. Israel, there's a Palestinian sovereignty, okay? Israel will not allow...
And how would they prevent that? How would they prevent it?
With every means at their disposal.
How? How? What are the
means of force?
I'm sorry?
Force. What is preventing it now?
Building illegal settlements.
If you run for parliament, they will arrest you?
No, but there's no meaning to Palestinian sovereignty. There's no meaning. If an Israeli soldier can go into any Palestinian house.
If you're Israeli running for parliament or president,
yes,
how would they prevent you from doing that?
It can prevent it in many ways. It's not.
How?
That's not the question. The question
is the question.
We can set up a whole system of elections and going forth and going back, but it's meaningless if there's no sovereignty, no power behind it. And there is no power behind it. Power is sovereignty.
There is the legitimacy of the election.
Joseph, I'm sorry, I'm going to have to go.
Okay.
My apologies. I'm very grateful that you invited me, and it's a fascinating conversation, and I applaud you all for doing this thinking. I really do.
All right, you could leave, and those of you who want to stay, please do.
Thank you, Peter.
Okay, so Emmanuel.
Yeah.
Please tell me how would the Israeli government be able to prevent this election
Well,
from
first off,
happening?
Joseph, first off, it could be prevented simply by hacking into the election.
Hacking.
You could basically attack the means for the election, which you are suggesting be online. You've already had people hack into your meetings.
So you're saying, you're saying the Israeli government will act as criminals in order to prevent their people, people from having peace.
They're not sorry, they're not acting as criminals. The Israeli government is sovereign in Israel. They can pass legislation, and they can pass legislation in the Knesset, and they can use the force at their which they have legal force to hack whatever they decide is threatening them, and they do that. They do that already today. Okay, so this is not something we just talking about.
The best thing for the Confederation would be if the Israeli government decide to pass legislation to dismantle this, because they will have to explain why did they fail to make peace. They'll have to explain, they will have to have a rationale, and they wouldn't have a rationale. They cannot have a rationale that says we are the power and we do it because we have the power. They'll have to explain why they are continuing to go to war and continuing with the occupation when they do not have a rationale.
They have no problem with that. This whole system is not rational.
But I'm asking you, what would be their rationale? I am saying they will have a problem with that. They will have a problem with that.
Okay.
They would, not only would they have a problem with that, but the moment they do that, they would go to rioting to the Confederation. They would expose themselves as unable to make peace. They would expose themselves as being bullies.
The government of Israel has no problem with that. It's doing that now. It's exposing itself. It doesn't want peace. It's bullies. It's doing terrible things. And there's absolutely no problem. And the world accepts us.
Yeah, it can do it inside Israel. It can portray Hamas as being a terrorist. Then they have legitimacy. But here they have their own people running, their own people from Israel and Palestine, and they have no vision. They will be exposing themselves to the whole world as unreasonable, as having no vision for peace.
They have no problem with that.
I understand
we have no problem. We are exposed. We have no vision for peace. We have no policy for peace. We do terrible things. We have absolutely no problem with that. We're not embarrassed. The world is accepting it the way it is, and there are only a few million people in the community who are against it.
No, they have no problem shooting a Palestinian because they say he's a terrorist. So they have an explanation. Whether it's true or not, doesn't matter. They have no problem. But here you have your own people in Tel Aviv, in the city, in their own cities, saying, you know what? We are not terrorists. We are served in the Israeli military. We want peace because you do not have a vision for peace. What I am saying is that the narrative will change completely.
Yeah. Okay, somebody else chip in because I don't want to monopolize the conversation.
Okay, anyone else has comments?
I have a comment. It seems that the underlying rationale, and Emmanuel can give me his feedback on that or response, but it all seems to be hinged on the thought, the belief that Palestinians would want to destroy Israel or to hurt Israelis in some way. So if for some reason a miracle happened and tomorrow Palestinians said, we're happy that Israelis are here and we love to share the land, if that became a way of thought, would there still be Israel insisting on saying the Palestinians are terrorists or to not give them equal rights. If that perception changed, that people thought that now they're not, now they don't want to destroy us, would that make a difference to Israel, or would they still insist on having unequal rights? Emmanuel?
If this would come over time, it may make a difference. But if it came all of a sudden, that wouldn't work, of course. I think the only thing which would work, and that would work both ways, and that ties in what Peter said, would be to create a Palestinian mass movement for civil rights, which would work not violently, because that would make, first of all, would be a real threat for Israel. It would not be able to deal with that in the regular way with force, if it was really a peaceful movement for equal rights. And it also would be indicative of the Palestinians, that the Palestinians are not interested in violence. So that would be I think if I was a Palestinian, I would advise Palestinians that I would I suggest that they would do that. But they're not there yet, and so that's something to look forward to.
Robert,
Because if I have a comment, if you don't mind.
Robert, I think you've asked an excellent question, and I think that it really touches at the heart of the issue. See, Israel is pushing the Palestinians constantly and putting them under occupation. It could have removed the occupation and make them equal citizens and have one state, but Israel does not want to do that. And as long as, and Israel understands that the occupation by itself creates the Palestinians to be anti-Israel. And in order to continue to have an Israeli government in the constellation that the Israeli government is, it needs the Palestinians to be anti-Israel. And the beauty of what we are doing, we are saying, we are not anti-Israel. We are not even Palestinians. We are Palestinians and Israelis, and we are not anti-Israel. So we are creating a completely different narrative. And that's where I think Israel will not be able to respond, because it's its own citizens. It's calling for equality. It's calling for the legitimacy of the government of Israel and the legitimacy of the Palestinian government. And you saw Peter BEINART was saying they will oppose it because they want to oppose it, but he never really gave a rationale why they will be able to oppose it.
The rationale is simple. It's a circular argument, and it's a circular argument, but the argument is simply, well, the Palestinians, you can't trust them, they're going to hurt us. So we have to keep them down. And obviously keeping them down is going to cause anger. And so it just keeps the whole thing going. So
no, that's not the rationale for the IPC. That's the rationale against the Palestinian, but it's not the rationale against the IPC.
But it gives them a reason for not wanting to surrender any authority or sovereignty whatsoever to the IPC. As long as they have that argument, they can sell that argument to enough people to keep things the way they are right now.
I disagree with you. I think that if this government is created, and if we have 5 million people voting, Israel would need legitimacy to oppose it, and it would not have that legitimacy. And also Hamas and the PA will probably may want to oppose it, because no one wants competition. So I think that the beauty of what we are proposing here today is that neither the Israeli nor the Palestinian government would have a rationale. You saw that not only do they have no rationale, they're willing to give him money.
Joseph.
Yes.
I have a comment.
Please.
Is that okay? previous speakers, including Peter, they were alluded to the civil rights movement in the United States and the reasons it succeeded, and also the conditions in South Africa. But here we are moving toward a new world order. These conditions is going to, and in the case of China, China doesn't have a colonial history, especially with the people in Africa, the Middle East, Central Asia. And it's coming, its economy growing, and it's going to come with soft power. And unless Israel and the West realize this, we did not leave good memories in Africa, the Middle East. This is going to be a real challenge. I think it is in the interest of the Israelis and everybody, the Palestinians, is really to realize we are moving toward a new world order, and peace is the best solution for everybody. China right now, the United States left Afghanistan. They're going to move economically through Central Asia, Afghanistan, all the way to the Mediterranean, and build the bridges by sea or land to the rest of the African continent, the Middle East. And so my point is, why do we have to wait until the things push us to do things by force? We have minds, and we could preempt a lot of tragedies and pain for people and bring peace.
Okay, I would like to
especially giving an educated society in Israel. They are very well versed in history. They are highly educated. They should see that better than anywhere else.
I agree. Okay, I think it's time for closing remarks.
Let me get one in, please.
Brian, hi.
I really, how you guys, how's everyone doing? I haven't spoken yet, but when everybody was talking at once, I came up with an idea a few minutes ago. And it's the concept of, of course, we're trying to work on mental health. That's the overall goal. And then we say it's impossible to do that. How are we going to get these people together and have them talk like the way we're in this meeting room talking now? And I just wanted to give an idea out just in case I don't have time to work on my conflict resolution paper for the essay contest, basically. But it's the concept of taking the funds and allocating them in a way that gets these people of Israel and Palestine in a room together as we are now to talk. Otherwise, they won't get paid. A way of redistributing the funds to the people, which needs to be done globally. And the more they participate and have partners from the other side come in the room and talk together, the way we are now, the more they'll get paid, or some type of redistribution, clause in that nature. And so I wanted to bring that up because people will do things more when they're being paid than not, and then the process will just kind of happen by itself. So I just kind of wanted to throw that out there because that's.
Thank you, Brian. It's time for closing remarks. We believe that the Confederation could be created. We need, with international grassroots support, educating and recruiting candidates from Israel and Palestine to run in the districts. I'm asking if you can share the vision with your social media, continue to support the simulations and participate in the simulation, and contact the media. Also, the United Teachers of Los Angeles is going to be voting on Israel-Palestine. If you want to tell them about the Confederation, please do so. And send me an email. I'll give you the email of those people that need to be contacted at the United Teachers of Los Angeles. Our next simulation is on August 22nd with Noam Chomsky. Then we have September 6th with Dennis Ross. Then September 19th with Alan Dershowitz, and October 3rd, Cornel West. So I hope to see you there. And thank you so much for joining today. it's important that we'll see you in the next simulations. So
Thank you, Joseph.
thank you so
Thank you, Joseph.
No problem.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
See you later. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.